plus years in slavery. Generations came and went without knowing anything different. This was a people with a slave mentality. It was all they knew. God brings them out and now has to train them at what being a nation, a free nation, is all about. And he does this by giving them the law. Some would say that what God had done was simply made them into slaves to him. Now, in those days, there were many nations whose rulers claimed to be gods, or at the very least, God's representative. That was very common. In fact, Pharaoh was one of them. Other cultures and communities in the area had the same thing. But here, there's a distinction. The distinction is that in Israel, God himself was the ruler. The earthly rulers here made no claim to divinity. They made no claim to divinity. Moses never said, I am God on earth. Never made that claim. God is God. And Moses says, I'll tell you what God tells me to tell you, but that's about it for me. The earthly rulers made no claim to divinity, and they were, in fact, held even more accountable before the true king. So now, with a fresh start and a new identity that is having been recreated, it's now time to live a new life. The life they had led was the life of slaves. Got up, the only thing they had to worry about was what their masters were going to tell them to do. What was their task? That's all. Now, they were a nation. They had the freedom to choose for themselves. It's a completely different life. And this is the picture of tabernacles. This is the setting in which Sukkot takes place. Sukkot is a reminder of the time when the children of Israel were living in the wilderness. But it is important to remember that this was an incredible time. And during all of it, God was among them, just like he said he would be. He was there in the pillar of cloud. He was there in the pillar of fire. He was among his people. They were, for the most part, living according to the new life that God had given them. God had set out all of these things that they needed to do, all of these ways of living. Why did he do that? Because they needed it. They needed it. All they knew was the slavery thing. They needed God to tell them how to live this life as a nation. And for the most part, they did it. They were walking within the boundaries of the covenant that they had made with God. That is to say, they were obedient to his law. For the most part. For the most part. Were they perfect? No, of course not. Far from it. We read in the scriptures that there were plenty of times during their wanderings that their slave mentality kicked in. Sometimes in high gear. I don't think it was something that they had intentionally set out to do. I don't think they wanted to have that kind of mentality. It was just ingrained in them. More likely it was a flashback to the previous life that they had as slaves and their desire to be out of that situation and to not go back. For example, Korach. Does everybody remember Korach? I mean, not personally, but you remember in the story? Korach rebelled against Moses. He said, hey, you ain't the only one in authority. And as a result, he and 250 of his family and friends, those who supported him, got eaten up by the earth. Just swallowed up. Just like that. Now, it seems like that may have been a flashback to this slave mentality. They had no choice during their slavery but to submit to their masters because their masters said so. And this slave mentality kicks in Korach and says, hey, who are you? Just because you say you're the representative of God or whatever, who are you to tell me? I don't think he had intended on being that. That's just who he was. Similarly, when Aaron and Miriam rebelled. Do you remember that? When Aaron and Miriam rebelled against Moses? It was an attempt at equality. It was an attempt. And equality, not a bad thing, especially when you've come from that slave mentality, when there are clearly those who have set themselves above you. Equality, not a bad thing. Unless you're trying to be equal with God. That's a bad thing. Okay? We saw that back in Babel, and that didn't work either. But here, Aaron and Miriam are not trying to establish equality with God. They're simply trying to establish equality before God. Equality with Moses. And I believe that this is stemming from that slavery mentality. Now, I'm not condoning either of those rebellious behaviors. Don't hear me saying that. What I am saying is that even when they had the freedom to choose and behave as free people were, sometimes they just didn't. Sometimes they reverted back to what they used to be. Sometimes, in the biblical vernacular, they wanted to go back to Egypt. The new life that we live as believers in Messiah Yeshua is not a life of perfection. This new life is a life with a new set of options. It's a life that gives us the opportunity to live to the fullest. It is the ability to choose for good that has now been afforded to us. Will we always take it? No. But wait a minute, you're believers, right? Everything is perfect for you. Everything is easy. You make all the right choices and you don't sin anymore. Because you're good Christians. No. God never promises us that. He promises us the ability to choose, and he promises to forgive us when we make the wrong choice. And then he promises to give us in the next moment the ability to make a different choice. That's what he promises us. That is the new life. It's the life not of slavery, but of freedom. It's the freedom to choose. Will we always take the good choice? No. But that doesn't mean we aren't free, and it doesn't mean we aren't free to make a different choice the very next time around. So the fact of our freedom is the fact that we now have the ability to choose God on his ways. Make no mistake. And if you're writing notes, here or at home, you can write this down. A choice for something is always a choice against something else. A choice for something is always a choice against something else. In this case, a choice for God is a choice against the ways of the world. And that's the way it works. And looking at the Torah portion for this morning, this is the pattern that we see. The people rebel with the golden calf. The very thing that they thought in their own strength would bring them closer to God, in fact, tore them away from God. And as a result, the covenant, which is the relationship between God and us, was broken. This is exceptionally reminiscent of what happened in the garden. God enters a covenant with us. We break the covenant. The relationship between us and God is severed, and we need something to help us repair it, because we can't do it by ourselves. So with this relationship broken between the Israelites and God, Moses steps in and intercedes. He reminds God that these are his people, and that they wouldn't be any different from the other nations if he wasn't with them. If he wasn't Emmanuel, then the people weren't his people. And because he is God, who is, according to this morning's portion, compassionate,